map of the Middle East is being rewritten, not in ink, but in the fire of long-range munitions and the cold logic of kinetic attrition. As American B-1B Lancer bombers cycle through the thin air of the upper atmosphere, dropping their payloads into the heart of the Iranian plateau, the world watches the end of an era. We are no longer talking about deterrence. We are witnessing the raw, unadulterated application of great power compellence against a regional challenger. The B-1B Lancer, affectionately known as the Bone by its crews, is a relic of the Cold War that has found a terrifying new purpose in the 21st century. Designed for high-speed, low-level penetration of the most contested airspaces on Earth, the Lancer represents the absolute peak of American conventional strike capability. When these variable sweep-wing bombers roared off the tarmac of distant bases like Al Udeid or the remote island of Diego Garcia, they were not merely conducting a mission. They were projecting the full, unyielding weight of American strategic frustration. For 3 decades, the United States has attempted to manage the Iranian problem through the gray zone, a twilight struggle of sanctions, cyber warfare, and proxy skirmishes. But the logic of the gray zone has reached its limit. Sanctions do not dismantle hardened missile silos, and diplomatic communiques do not sink fast attack craft. The decision to launch a shock strike directly into the Iranian interior marks a fundamental, irreversible shift in the American force posture. We have moved beyond the policing of regional irritants and returned to the demolition of rival capacity. Geographically, Iran is not just a country, it is a fortress. It is a massive, rugged plateau shielded by the Zagros Mountains to the west and the Alborz to the north. This geography has historically been Tehran's greatest asset, allowing it to trade space for time and forcing any potential invader into a grueling uphill slog through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. The Zagros Range acts as a natural wall, rising up to 14,000 feet, making ground invasion a logistical impossibility for any modern army. But the B-1B strike is a direct assault on that geographical advantage. By utilizing the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, or JASSM-ER, American planners have effectively circumvented the mountains. These stealthy cruise missiles, launched from hundreds of miles away, can weave through the valleys of the Zagros to strike targets deep within the Iranian heartland. They can hit the center of gravity targets, the IRGC's underground missile cities, the drone assembly plants in Isfahan, and the command and control bunkers in Tehran without the bombers ever entering the lethal envelope of Iran's S-300 or Bavar 373 air defense systems. The history of the B-1B itself is a testament to the evolution of great power reach. Originally intended to carry nuclear gravity bombs into the Soviet Union, it was stripped of its nuclear mission to comply with arms control treaties, only to become the world's most versatile conventional truck. It carries a larger payload than the B-52, and it does so with a radar cross-section significantly smaller. In this specific operation, the Bone is the scalpel and the sledgehammer combined. The strikes targeted the very infrastructure that Iran uses to project power into the Levant and the Red Sea. The drone factories that supply the Houthis, the ballistic missile depots that threaten Tel Aviv, and the intelligence hubs that coordinate the axis of resistance were all systematically dismantled in the first 4 hours of the operation. This is the essence of modern power projection, the ability to reach out and touch the most sensitive nodes of an enemy's power while remaining strategically untouchable. The logistics of an operation of this magnitude are staggering and speak to a level of power that no other nation can currently replicate. A B-1B flight from a continental U.S. base to the Middle East requires a massive, invisible tail of support. We are talking about dozens of aerial refueling tankers, such as the KC 135 and the newer KC-46, stationed at intervals across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. This is the tanker bridge, a logistical feat that allows American bombers to operate across 10,000 miles without landing. We are talking about ELINT aircraft like the RC-135 rivet joint circling the periphery of the target zone, vacuuming up every electronic signal to jam enemy radars, We are talking about satellite constellations providing real-time target updates to missiles in mid-flight. This is not just a bombing run. It is a globally synchronized ballet of hard power. When the first explosions rocked the IRGC facilities at Natanz and Isfahan, they shattered more than just concrete and steel. They shattered the illusion of Iranian strategic depth. For years, Tehran has operated under the assumption that its geography and its proxy network provided a shield that the United States would never dare to pierce directly. They believed that by threatening a regional conflagration, they could keep the great Satan at bay. The B-1B strike proved that when the stakes are high enough, Washington is willing to ignore the proxies and go for the jugular. The mountains, which had for centuries been Tehran's shield, suddenly became the walls of a cage. The strike was designed as a systemic shock, an attempt to paralyze the Iranian leadership by demonstrating that nowhere in their fortress country is safe. However, in the world of great power realism, every action triggers a reaction dictated by the constraints of physical reality. While the U.S. may dominate the sky with its high-tech bombers, Iran dominates the surface of the most important maritime choke point on the planet. The Persian Gulf is a narrow, shallow basin, and at its mouth lies the Strait of Hormuz. This is the ultimate counterweight in the balance of power. Every barrel of oil that leaves the Gulf must pass through this 21-mile wide gap. This is where the kinetic victory of the B-1B strike meets the brutal, low-tech reality of naval logistics and economic warfare. The American strike may have neutralized the Iranian Air Force, but it has simultaneously forced Iran to play its most dangerous card. The kinetic success of the Lancer strike has momentarily blinded the world to the underlying structural reality. The air is won, but the water remains contested. As Washington celebrates a tactical masterstroke, Tehran is already activating a plan decades in the making, designed to turn American strength against itself. The shift from air superiority to maritime survival is about to reveal the true cost of challenging a regional power that holds the world's energy jugular. The logic of escalation is a cold, mathematical progression where every move is calculated based on the enemy's perceived breaking point. When a sovereign state's heartland is hit by a superpower, its response is not dictated by morality, but by the necessity of regime survival and regional relevance. Iran knows it cannot win a traditional dogfight with the U.S. Air Force, nor can it survive a fleet-on-fleet engagement with an American carrier strike group in the open waters of the Arabian Sea. Therefore, Tehran pivots to the Mosaic defense, a decentralized, asymmetric strategy designed to turn the Persian Gulf into a graveyard of trillion-dollar assets. This is where the geography of the Strait of Hormuz becomes a weapon more potent than any stealth bomber. The strait is a geographical bottleneck, and for Iran, this isn't just a waterway, it is a kill zone. As the smoke still rises from the bombed-out ruins of the IRGC headquarters, Iran's response begins not with a loud declaration of war, but with a silent, lethal deployment. Under the cover of darkness, hundreds of small, fast-attack boats and converted civilian vessels begin dropping smart mines into the shipping lanes of the Gulf. These are not the simple contact mines of the past. These are sophisticated, influence-triggered weapons like the EM-52, which can be programmed to ignore a small patrol boat and wait for the specific magnetic or acoustic signature of a massive oil tanker or an American destroyer. Simultaneously, the IRGC Navy activates its swarming doctrine. Thousands of suicide drones, such as the Shahed 136 and shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles like the Noor and the Qadr, are moved from their mountain tunnels to hidden mobile launch sites along the jagged, indented coastline of the Makran. They do not need to sink an American aircraft carrier to win. They only need to hit enough commercial tankers to send the global insurance markets into a catastrophic spiral. The London insurance market, Lloyd's, and other major underwriters is the silent arbiter of this conflict. The moment a single VLCC, very large crude carrier, is hit by a mine or a drone, the insurance premiums for the Gulf skyrocket, effectively making it impossible for merchant shipping to operate. This is the Hormuz trap. The logic of power here is built on leverage using the global economy as a shield against American military aggression. When oil prices jump 30 or 40% in a single afternoon, the real pressure on Washington does not come from the Iranian military. It comes from the domestic electorate and from allies in Tokyo, Seoul, and Berlin who are seeing their economies strangled by the energy spike. The United States now faces a brutal logistical and tactical choice. To clear the mines and reopen the straits, it must deploy its mine countermeasures, MCM, assets. But the U.S. Navy's mine-sweeping fleet is small and aged. These vessels are slow, poorly armed, and must operate at a snail's pace to clear a path. This makes them perfect targets for Iranian drone swarms and shore-based missiles. To protect the minesweepers, the U.S. must deploy its destroyers and cruisers close to the Iranian coast, well within the anti-access area denial, or A2, AD bubble. This is exactly what Tehran wants. By drawing the U.S. Navy into the shallow, cluttered waters of the Gulf, they negate the range advantage of American carrier aviation and force the conflict into a knife fight in a phone booth. The escalation ladder now demands that the U.S. launch a full-scale campaign to suppress the Iranian coastline. This means thousands of additional sorties, targeting every mobile missile launcher and drone site along 1,000 miles of rugged coast. But the cost exchange ratio is heavily in Iran's favor. A single Iranian drone costing $20,000 can threaten a destroyer costing $2 billion. $1,000 mine can disable a $100 million LCS, literal combat ship. This is the math of asymmetric attrition. Furthermore, the logistical tail for the U.S. becomes a nightmare. To maintain a sustained bombardment, the U.S. needs to ferry in thousands of tons of munitions, fuel, and supplies. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, these supplies must come in via the port of Salalah in Oman or through the Red Sea, and then across the Saudi desert, a logistical bypass that is vulnerable to Houthi or IRGC-linked sabotage. Meanwhile, the regional axis of resistance is activated to pin down American assets elsewhere. Hezbollah, with its arsenal of 150,000 rockets, begins a systematic bombardment of northern Israel, forcing the U.S. to divert its Mediterranean-based assets to defend its ally. In Iraq and Syria, Dunquan groups launch wave after wave of Grad rockets and drones at American bases like Al-Tanf and Ain al-Assad. The goal is to create a total theater conflict where the U.S. is forced to defend everything at once. This is strategic overextension. The B-1B strike was a singular, focused event, but the Iranian response is a multidimensional, geographic-wide contagion. The U.S. finds itself in a situation where each military success leads to a greater economic and logistical failure. As the conflict intensifies, the surrounding regional players, the Gulf monarchies, are forced into a terrifying calculation. While they may secretly cheer the American strikes on Iran, they are also the most vulnerable to the Iranian response. Their desalination plants, which provide 90% of their fresh water, and their massive oil terminals like Ras Tanura are fixed, undefended targets for Iranian missile barrages. One well-placed salvo could take a major refinery offline for months, plunging the region into an economic dark age. This is coercive leverage in its purest form. Iran is not just fighting the U.S. military. It is holding the global energy supply hostage to ensure its own survival. The B-1B strike, intended to show overwhelming strength, has instead triggered a crisis that tests the very foundations of the American-led maritime order and the resilience of the global supply chain. The tactical brilliance of long-range aviation has run headfirst into the unforgiving reality of maritime geography and economic interdependency. Washington's move was a surgical strike, but Tehran's response is a systemic strangulation that threatens to pull the entire world into the abyss. We are now in a phase where the endurance of the global economy will determine the victor, not the sophistication of the missiles or the stealth of the bombers. The final act of this crisis is not defined by a treaty signed on the deck of a battleship, but by a fundamental and permanent realignment of the global balance of power. In the cold, calculating world of great power realism, a conflict is not won when the shooting stops, but when the new status quo is established. When a superpower utilizes its most advanced kinetic tools and yet finds itself bogged down in a protracted maritime attrition war with a regional challenger, the myth of hegemonistic omnipotence begins to crack. The United States may eventually succeed in clearing the Strait of Hormuz and suppressing the Iranian coastal batteries, but the cost of that victory will be so high that it reshapes American foreign policy for a generation. The first major consequence is strategic fatigue. The sheer volume of precision-guided munitions, JASSMs, Tomahawks, and SM-6 interceptors expended by the U.S. in just the first few weeks of the conflict is equivalent to several years of industrial production. This creates a munitions gap, while the U.S. is focused on reloading its silos in the Middle East. Its stockpiles for a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea are dangerously depleted. This is a zero-sum game of global power. Every missile fired at a drone factory in Iran is one less missile available to deter a peer competitor like China. This realization forces a brutal strategic reassessment in Washington. The Middle East is no longer a theater for optional interventions. It has become a high-cost drain on the very resources needed for the primary struggle of the 21st century. Iran, despite the heavy damage to its military infrastructure and the systemic shock of the initial B-1B strikes, emerges with its regime intact and its regional influence paradoxically solidified through the memory of its defiance. In the realist view, survival is victory. Tehran has proven to the world, and specifically to the global South, that it can survive a direct hit from the long arm of American power and retaliate in a way that hurts the global hegemon, where it is most vulnerable, the wallet. This is the hard realist outcome. It is not a Hollywood ending of regime change or the birth of a new democracy. It is a grittier, more dangerous reality of managed hostility and a return to spheres of influence. The Iranian plateau remains a fortress, and the Strait of Hormuz remains a dagger pointed at the heart of the global economy. The crisis also brings the great power rivals of the United States, Russia, and China into the fold in a decisive way. Throughout the conflict, Moscow and Beijing have played a waiting game, providing Iran with satellite intelligence and diplomatic cover while watching the American military-industrial complex strain under the pressure. For them, the Iranian resistance is a blueprint. If a regional power like Iran can frustrate the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force in the Persian Gulf, what could a peer competitor do in the first island chain? The American struggle to contain Iran sends a clear signal of overextension. China, in particular, may use the American distraction in the Middle East to accelerate its own territorial ambitions, knowing that the U.S. Navy's readiness has been depleted by months of minesweeping and convoy duty in the Gulf. This is the pivot to Asia in reverse. The U.S. is being pulled back into the Middle Eastern quicksand at the exact moment it needs to leave. The new map of the Middle East is one of fragmented influence and eroded trust. The U.S. retains its bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and the Emirates, but its aura of invincibility is gone. The Gulf monarchies, realizing that the American security umbrella has holes and that Washington's appetite for long-term conflict is waning, begin to diversify their security portfolios. They move closer to Beijing for diplomatic mediation and look to Moscow for weapons systems that do not come with the political strings of Washington. The hard realist conclusion is that geography cannot be overcome by technology alone. The plateau and the strait are permanent fixtures of the geopolitical landscape. The American presence is a variable that is in gay Kang subject to the laws of diminishing returns. Furthermore, the global energy market undergoes a structural shift. The Hormuz risk is now permanently priced into every barrel of oil. The world realizes that the era of cheap, secure energy from the Gulf is over. This accelerates the energy transition, not out of environmental concern, but out of national security necessity. Countries in Europe and Asia begin a frantic search for alternative energy routes and sources, further isolating the Middle East and reducing its long-term strategic value to the United States. By striking deep into Iran, the U.S. may have won the battle of the air, but it forced a confrontation with the reality of its own limits in a world that is no longer unipolar. As the last B-1B Lancers fly back across the Atlantic, returning to their hangars in South Dakota or Texas, the world they leave behind is more dangerous, more expensive, and more divided than when they took off. The logic of escalation has reached its plateau, and the parties are left staring at each other over a sea of wrecked tankers and smoldering ruins. The lesson of the strike is clear. In the age of great power competition, the ability to destroy is not the same as the ability to control. The B-1B strike was a masterpiece of kinetic power and logistical reach, but it was a failure of strategic foresight. The map of the world has been redrawn, and for the first time since the end of the Cold War, the lines are being dictated by the friction of geography and the resilience of regional challengers, not just by the will of Washington. The smoke over the Persian Gulf is finally clearing, but the strategic landscape has been permanently altered by the friction of power, the weight of geography, and the brutal reality of escalation. The era of low-cost intervention is dead, buried under the weight of Iranian asymmetrical defiance and the cold math of maritime logistics. What comes next is a world where every choke point is a potential battlefield, and every strike is a gamble with the very survival of the global order. The Lancer's flight was long, but the journey toward a post-American Middle East has just begun.